Hello, welcome to the Bible Source Text Podcast. We are going to start off here talking about the book of Genesis. So this episode will just be sort of an introduction to Genesis, sort of trying to contextualize it a little bit. So Genesis is the first book of the Torah, or Pentateuch. Christians often say Pentateuch. I personally kind of prefer to say Torah, just due to the fact that Pentateuch's kind of a mouthful. But Penta's 5, it's the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Jewish theologians use the term Torah. So the Torah explains humanity's relationship with God. First starting with creation and then through, the fall of man and the establishment of, early civilization. Really, though, the focus here of the Torah is on Israel. Very quickly, it moves from talking about, the creation of mankind to speaking of Abraham and his descendants and going from Abraham up through Moses. So the Torah also explains Israel's law. And this was not just the law in the sense of moral precepts, but also a civil code for how Israel would be run. And so the focus very quickly goes on to Israel. Parts of the Torah are structured like an ancient covenant between two kings. Oftentimes you'd have a higher king, a more powerful king, that would impose a covenant onto a lower king, sort of a peace treaty with conditions and things, and that's actually the form that a lot of the Torah takes. Not Genesis so much, so I'm kind of getting ahead of us in bringing that up, but just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, Genesis does not name an author. Tradition actually attributes the authorship to Moses, and later scholarship cannot confirm or deny this. Fact is, we don't know. Personally, I don't think that Moses wrote the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy. The author says that Moses was the most humble man that ever lived, which doesn't sound like something the most humble man that ever lived would actually write. That's a bit of textual evidence that I don't think you could argue that Moses was the author of the Torah. At the same time, it doesn't really disprove it. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if Moses wrote it or not. The text never says Moses wrote it. It is also possible, and I'd say more likely, that this was compiled by various Jewish scribes from other sources. This is really the origin of what is sometimes called by historians the documentary hypothesis, which is that the Torah came from 4 distinct sources compiled together. What's interesting about this is we don't have those 4 sources. This is a process by which some textual critics have tried to identify different verses and different passages that come from different sources and kind of tried to create a framework where we could take these 4 hypothetical documents that were compiled together into the Torah we have now. The 4 documents being the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, the Deuteronomist source, and the priestly source. Again, ultimately doesn't matter. I mean, this shouldn't have an impact on your faith of whether or not this is scripture just because it was compiled from possibly other different sources. The idea that the book of Genesis could still form a coherent narrative just because they drew from different sources, that's not an unreasonable idea. But let's talk about Genesis specifically. The name Genesis comes from Greek. It's roughly the Greek word for origin. In Hebrew, the text is called simply in the beginning, which are the first 3 words of it. Genesis takes the form of a myth. And I know I said this in my intro video. When I say myth, I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm not saying, people say, it's just a myth. That's not the way I mean it. I'm saying that it's a work that tells the origins of the things in the world, the origins of the people and of the world itself. And it's important to remember that the Bible uses the form of different genres to communicate its message. So when I refer to the Genesis as being myth, I'm not saying it's untrue. I'm saying that that's the genre that it would fall into. Genesis doesn't really argue that the events happened. The events are just simply assumed to have happened. It tells you this happened, and that's as far as it goes. The book's certainly more concerned with the theological significance of those events. What do those events mean? And that fits with a lot of other ancient Near Eastern sources, which is to say that they're concerned with the meaning of the events, not the events themselves. John Van Seters once argued that Genesis takes the form of a national epic. It is a story of the origin of the Israelites. And you can certainly see that as we go through, as we get into, starting with, the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark, but very quickly going into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is the bulk of the text. As far as themes that we see throughout the text, this text is concerned with the origin of God's chosen people, but in a lot of ways, Genesis is also a counter to other ancient Near Eastern mythologies. There are elements to Genesis where they're best understood as a reaction to things we see in other ancient texts. And there are motifs and themes and symbols that are common across different mythological sources. Genesis is also rare in that it focuses on nomadic herdsmen, whereas a lot of the other ancient Near Eastern texts that we have, similar texts that we have, focus on city dwellers. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a great example. The Epic of Gilgamesh, it's just kind of assumed that city life is more civilized than life out in the wilds. That's the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but we'll have plenty of time to get into that and comparisons there later on. The point is, Genesis focuses on the nomads. Abraham leaves the city of Ur in Mesopotamia and goes off wandering through the wilderness. Israel and his sons, they're living out, raising sheep out in the wilderness, not in cities, at least until they go to Egypt. So Genesis is interesting in that sense. If we're trying to learn about ancient Near Eastern culture, it gives us a perspective that a lot of other ancient sources simply do not. From a more theological standpoint, we see in the book of Genesis some very early messianic prophecies. Genesis 3:15 is often cited by Christian theologians as the first prophecy of the Messiah. And I'll make enemies of you and the woman, and of your offspring and her descendant. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. That descendant is, by Christian theologians, assumed to be Jesus. God tells Abraham, in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Again, that's assumed to be a reference to the Messiah. And very late in the Genesis narrative, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. To him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Again, that's often interpreted as a prophecy that the Messiah will be from the tribe of Judah, which Jesus was. There is also a theme in the book of Genesis of deception. There are several cases where people resort to deception to do something or get something. Abraham does twice in chapters 12 and 20 that he feels forced to deceive someone. Jacob extorted Esau in chapter 25, or when later Rebekah and Jacob trick Isaac to get his blessing in chapter 27. Esau got the short end of the stick on both of those deals, but the point is Jacob, who is part of the bloodline that we're tracing, is resorting to deception. Jacob is tricked into marrying Leah in chapter 29. He wanted to marry Rebekah, but then he later tricks his father-in-law Laban in the next chapter to get the best of his flocks. There's the story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38, which is definitely an interesting one. If you've not read that, I don't want to spoil it. There's a lot that we can delve into about the cultural context in that one. And then there's, the entire story of Joseph that involves Joseph deceiving his brothers, kind of playing a gambit where he'll benefit no matter how it goes, but that requires deceiving his brothers. So there is definitely a theme of deception. There's also a theme running throughout Genesis of undermining the assumption that the firstborn having some sort of primacy. That was very ingrained into the culture of the time. So it's interesting that Genesis so many times subverts that. Cain is the older brother, and yet Abel is the one that finds favor by doing what's right. Ishmael is the firstborn of Abraham, and yet Isaac is the one that is part of the chosen bloodline. Esau is the firstborn, and yet Jacob ends up with a birthright. And Joseph is not the youngest, but he is not the eldest, and yet he winds up being in charge of Egypt. And so that theme of undermining these cultural assumptions related to birth order, that's an interesting theme that we can discuss as we go along. So we will start in the next episode in actually analyzing the book of Genesis. We'll start with Genesis 1 and go right through to Genesis chapter 50. I'll see you next time. Thank you.